He said it in front of everyone. Not whispered, not implied, said it out loud, in the middle of the staff lounge, with a coffee cup in one hand and a smirk that had probably worked on people his whole life. Somebody must have checked the wrong diversity box. Laughter, not from everyone, but enough. Nadia Osei-Thornton set her mug down on the counter and looked at him, didn't flinch, didn't speak, just looked the way a person looks at a small thing that has made itself very loud. Then she picked up her mug, walked to her office, and closed the door behind her. That was her first week at Harrowfield Secondary School in Hamilton, Ontario. She'd already survived worse, much worse. The kind of worse that doesn't get talked about at dinner parties, but gets folded into a person's spine and stays there, holding them upright long after everyone else has collapsed. But we'll get to that. Nadia had taken the vice principal position at Harrowfield in September, transferred from a high school in Sudbury where she'd spent 11 years turning a failing arts program into something the province had written about twice. She was 53 years old. She wore her locks pinned back on school days and let them fall loose on Fridays. She drove a sensible Subaru. She brought her own tea because the school's coffee was, in her words, an act of institutional violence. She was not the kind of person who announced herself. She didn't need to. Her record did it for her, though some people at Harrowfield hadn't bothered to read it. Greg Palliser had not bothered to read it. Palliser was the head of the English department. 44 years old, 19 years at the same school, the kind of man who mistook tenure for talent and longevity for wisdom. He had a loud laugh and a louder opinion and a habit of holding court in the staff lounge, like it was his personal talk show. The other teachers laughed at his jokes with the practiced timing of people who had learned that it was easier to laugh. He had decided, within 48 hours of Nadia's arrival, that she was a problem. Not because she'd done anything. That was the thing that would matter later, when everything fell apart for him. She hadn't challenged him, hadn't corrected him publicly, hadn't taken anything that was his. She had simply walked into a room and been more than he expected, and Greg Palliser was the kind of man who experienced other people's competence as a personal attack. She's only here because of the board's equity initiative, he told Raymond, the history teacher who laughed the loudest at Greg's jokes. You know that, right? Harrowfield needed a box checked. Raymond nodded. Raymond always nodded. What Greg didn't know, what none of them had looked up, because looking things up would have required curiosity, and curiosity would have required humility, was who Nadia Osei-Thornton actually was. She had spent 14 years with the Canadian Forces before she ever set foot in a classroom. 14 years. She'd deployed twice, served as a logistics officer, and by the end of her military career held the rank of major. When she left the forces, she went back to school, got her teaching certification, her master's in educational leadership, and then spent the next decade doing quietly extraordinary work in schools that other people had given up on. She had a medal she kept in a shoebox in her closet, not because she was ashamed of it, because she didn't need anyone to see it to know what she'd done to earn it. But Greg Palliser had not Googled her name. He had looked at her and decided what she was, and that decision had made him feel safe. He was not safe. He just didn't know it yet. The first month, Nadia kept her head down. This was not weakness. This was method. She'd learned it in the forces. You don't move until you understand the terrain. You observe. You listen. You catalog. She watched Greg perform his routine in the lounge, watched the way the younger teachers deferred to him, watched the way the principal, a soft-spoken man named Terence, who smiled at everything and decided nothing, laughed along with whatever Greg said, and then immediately forgot he'd done it. She also watched the other things, the things Greg thought no one noticed. The way he dismissed Marcus Webb's lesson proposals in department meetings with a single sentence, and then presented a near-identical version of the same idea 3 weeks later as his own. The way he spoke to the 2 black students in his senior English class. Shorter responses, less encouragement, a particular brand of tired patience he never showed the others. The way he looked at her in the hallways. That specific look. She'd seen it before. She recognized it the way you recognize weather. She started keeping notes. Not obsessively, not with anger, with the same calm she'd used to track supply lines and personnel movements in conditions that would have broken most people. She noted dates, times, exact words when she could remember them. She kept the notes in a locked folder on her personal laptop, backed up to a drive she kept at home. She told no one. She waited. October brought the incident with the library. The school's library had been underfunded for 6 years. Nadia had flagged it in her second week. The collection was outdated. The reading programs had been cut. The librarian, a quiet woman named Petra, had been doing the work of 3 people for 2 years and had the posture of someone who had stopped expecting help. Nadia drafted a proposal, detailed, cited, with 3 different funding pathways, including a provincial grant the school hadn't applied for in 4 years. She submitted it to Terence in the first week of October. By the 3rd week of October, the proposal had somehow ended up in Greg's department meeting as a concern about resource allocation. Her words, her data, her frameworks, presented by Greg as the product of a broader staff conversation. He had not spoken to her about it, had not asked, had not acknowledged where the information came from. The other teachers nodded along. Petra looked at her hands. Nadia said nothing in the meeting. After the meeting, she updated her notes. She also made a copy of the original time-stamped document she'd sent to Terence, added a note about the date of Greg's presentation, and filed it separately. She was building something, quietly, the way you build anything that has to hold weight. November was when it escalated. It started with the incident report. A grade 11 student, a young black girl named Chiamaka, who was not Chiamaka from the name file, but a different girl entirely, had been sent out of Greg's class 3 times in 2 weeks. Each time, the incident report listed the same reason, disruptive behavior. Each time, the description was vague. Each time, when Nadia pulled Chiamaka aside and asked her what had happened, the girl's answers were specific, consistent, and troubling. Nadia requested a meeting with Greg. Greg arrived 9 minutes late and spent the first 4 minutes of the meeting talking about how much pressure English teachers were under this semester. "I'm hearing some concerns from students in your senior class," Nadia said. "I want to give you the chance to speak to them directly." "Students always have concerns," Greg said. "That's what students do. They push back on structure. These concerns are about specific interactions. I've been teaching for 19 years. I'm not questioning your experience. I'm asking about specific interactions." He looked at her then with something that wasn't quite contempt, but was adjacent to it. "Is this because of the library thing? Because I want to be clear. That was a collaborative initiative." Nadia looked at him for a moment. "We can revisit that separately," she said. "Right now, I'd like to stay on the student concerns." Greg shrugged. "I'll review my approach." He did not review his approach. The following Tuesday, Chiamaka was sent out again. This time, another student, a white boy who had been doing the same thing Chiamaka was doing, was not. Nadia documented it. She had a witness, Petra, who had been passing the classroom with a cart of returned books and had seen through the window. She called Petra into her office that afternoon. "Did you see what happened outside 214 this morning?" Petra looked at her carefully. "Yes." "Would you be willing to write down what you saw?" A long pause. "Will it make a difference?" "I think it might," Nadia said, "but I won't pretend I can guarantee anything." Petra wrote it down. By December, there were 4 separate documented incidents. Nadia had submitted 2 formal concerns to Terence. Terence had responded to the first one with a memo about maintaining collegial relationships. He had not responded to the second one at all. She escalated to the board. She did it quietly by the process, in exactly the way the documentation said to do it. She did not call anyone. She did not make it dramatic. She submitted a formal complaint through the correct channel, attached every piece of documentation, included dates and witnesses, and her own time-stamped notes going back to week 2. and then she waited. Greg, by this point, had started to realize something was happening. She could see it in the way he watched her now. Less contempt, more calculation. He'd started being careful around her in meetings, had stopped the loudest of his comments in the lounge, at least when she was in the room. Too late, by a wide margin. The complaint had already been filed. The documents were already read. The board's investigator arrived in the second week of January. Her name was not important to Greg at first. She introduced herself as an equity and conduct investigator, shook hands with Terrence, and asked for a private workspace. Terrence gave her the small conference room and spent the rest of the day pretending he wasn't nervous. Greg was called in on Wednesday. The investigator had Nadia's documentation in front of her. She had Petra's statement. She had the incident reports. She had the original library proposal with the timestamp and the metadata showing it had been opened and forwarded. Greg did what Greg always did when cornered. He talked. He explained context. He referenced his 19 years. He used the word collegial 4 times. He suggested that Nadia might have misread certain situations, given that she was still adjusting to the culture here. The investigator wrote things down and said very little. At one point, she asked him about the incident on the first day, the comment in the staff lounge, the diversity box remark. Greg said he didn't recall saying that. The investigator showed him a written account from 2 other staff members who had been in the lounge that morning. Greg said it might have been taken out of context. The investigator wrote that down too. There is a particular kind of silence that happens when a system finally starts to work the way it's supposed to. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's just a quiet reckoning. Paperwork processed, decisions made, consequences attached to actions, which is what consequences are supposed to be. Nadia was in her office when Terrence came to see her in late January. He sat down across from her with the look of a man who had recently discovered that not acting is also a choice, and that choices have paperwork, too. The board has made some decisions, he said. I expected they would, she said. Greg Palliser was placed on administrative leave pending a full review. The harassment finding was formal. The misappropriation of her work, the library proposal, had been flagged separately as a professional conduct matter. The incidents involving Chiamaka and the differential treatment of students had been referred to a separate process. Terrence himself received a formal letter of concern for his non-response to her second submission. He handed her a copy of his letter. She wasn't sure why. Maybe he needed someone to witness that he understood. She read it and set it on her desk. I should have moved faster, he said. Yes, she said, you should have. He nodded, didn't say anything else, got up and left. In February, the school board announced an internal review of complaint handling procedures in the Hamilton district. They didn't name Harrowfield specifically. They didn't need to. Petra got 2 new library assistants, and the provincial grant Nadia had flagged was approved. The library reopened its after-school reading program in March, with 22 students signed up in the first week. Chiamaka, who had spent most of November and December convinced she was the problem, came to Nadia's office in early February with a short story she'd written. She stood in the doorway and held it out with both hands, the way you hold something you've worked hard on and aren't sure about. Would you read it? She asked. Leave it on my desk, Nadia said. Come back tomorrow. She read it that evening. It was about a girl who kept being told she was too loud and eventually realized the people saying that were afraid of what she had to say. The next morning, she left it on Kayamaka's desk with a single note. This is very good. Keep writing. The story got out the way these things always do, imperfectly, through pieces, through the staff lounge and the parent council, and eventually a short item in the local paper that didn't use anyone's name, but was specific enough that anyone at Harrowfield knew exactly what it was about. The reactions were what they always were. Some people were grateful. Some people were defensive. One parent called the school to say the whole thing had been overblown, and Terrence handled that call himself, which was perhaps the first grown-up thing he'd done in months. A few younger teachers came to see Nadia, separately, one by one. They came with the particular energy of people who had been holding something down for a long time and were now deciding whether it was safe to set it down. She listened to each of them, took notes, told them what the process was, what it required, what she could and couldn't promise. "Will it work?" one of them asked. A young man, first year, the kind of tired that comes from realizing the institution you believed in doesn't always believe in you back. "It worked this time," Nadia said, "and this time is documented. So next time, it starts from here." He thought about that. "That's not exactly a yes," he said. "No," she said, "it's not, but it's more than nothing, and more than nothing is where everything starts." Greg Palliser did not return to Harrowfield. The review concluded in April. His case was referred to the Ontario College of Teachers for a conduct review. Whether his certificate would survive that process was not Nadia's concern. She had submitted what she had. She had done what she could. The rest was the processes to handle. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter than that, something closer to the feeling she'd had the first time she'd led a successful logistics operation in conditions that had looked, at the outset, completely unworkable. Not pride exactly, more like resolution. The knowledge that what needed to be done had been done, correctly, and would hold. On the last Friday of April, she let her locks fall loose the way she always did on Fridays. She made herself a cup of tea from the stash she kept in her desk drawer. She sat in her office and looked out the window at the courtyard, where a group of students were eating lunch in the thin April sun, talking about whatever grade 11 students talked about on Friday afternoons. Chiamaka was out there. She was reading. Nadia watched her for a moment. Then she finished her tea, picked up the stack of files she needed to review before Monday, and got back to work. There was a lot of it, as always. More than one person should reasonably manage. But she had managed more unreasonable things than this, in more difficult conditions, with fewer resources and higher stakes. She knew what she was. She had always known. It was just that now, so did Harrowfield. I keep thinking about the moment Nadia set her mug down on that counter. She didn't raise her voice, didn't argue, didn't explain herself to a man who had already decided what she was. She just looked at him, picked up her tea, and walked away. And I've been sitting with that image for a while now, because I think that's where the whole story actually lives. Not in the boardroom at the end, not in the formal findings, but in that quiet moment when she chose not to react. Most of us don't do that. Most of us bite back, or we shut down, or we go home and replay the scene for hours trying to think of what we should have said. I know I do. There's something in us that wants the confrontation to happen right then, in the moment, where everyone can see it. We want the record to be set straight immediately. We want to win the room. Nadia didn't want the room. She wanted the outcome. That's the part that stays with me. The discipline of it, the patience of it. She had 14 years of training that Greg Palliser knew nothing about, and she never once used it to intimidate him or embarrass him in front of his audience. She used it to build a case. Every time-stamped document, every note, every date and exact wording she could remember. Not out of calculation in some cold, strategic sense, but because she understood something that takes most people a lifetime to learn, that the truth needs to be recordable to be useful. Feeling wronged isn't enough. Knowing you're right isn't enough. You have to be able to show it. That's a kind of intelligence that doesn't get talked about enough. Not book smarts, not credentials. The intelligence of knowing how systems work, what they require, and how to move through them without losing yourself in the process. Nadia had it. She'd earned it in conditions I can barely imagine. But I don't think you need to have deployed twice to develop it. I think it's something any of us can build if we're willing to pay attention and stay honest about what we're actually seeing. And then there's Chiamaka, 17 years old, convinced she was the problem. That's the part that hurt the most to think about, the way a young person internalizes a system's failure as a personal flaw. She wasn't too loud. She was being silenced. There's a difference, and it matters enormously. And it took an adult with the integrity to keep pushing when the easier thing would have been to let it go. That's what I think this story is really about. Not revenge, not victory in any triumphant sense. It's about what happens when one person decides that the discomfort of speaking up is less than the cost of staying quiet. When they do the right thing, not because it's easy or immediately rewarded, but because it's right, and because some things have to be documented so that the next person who comes along starts from a better place than the last one did. Nadia didn't leave Harrowfield after all of it. She stayed. She got back to work. That, to me, is the whole story.